Like I said, I'm faculty at Baker Wetlands, Baker University. I'm on faculty at Baker University, also work at Baker University Wetlands. Let's see if I can get this right. And so my background is in wetlands, of course, but then I do more of the soils and the plants. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about my favorite two things, weeds and dirt. And kind of how the unique conditions, how plants adapt to those unique conditions that are there in the wetlands. And so having heard David's presentation earlier this morning, I know that he talked to you a little bit about what the definition of a wetland is. And so, kind of this is kind of a pared down version of that, but you have to have water, shallow water or saturated soils. And I think he gave you that definition of like during the growing season, you have to have water for at least 2 weeks, 3 weeks during the growing season. And it's kind of a funny definition. It's a very agricultural definition, right? Because the natural world growing season is year-round. There's not a growing season per se. But for reasons he kind of went through with his presentation, that definition has come into play here. But that shallow water and that saturated soil give you unique soil conditions. And then you have to have the plants that are adapted to those unique soil conditions. So I couldn't quite find the Venn diagram I wanted, but you can kind of think about like wetlands being kind of right there at that interflex of unique soils, unique plants, and having water on the ground. And so the water on the soil creates the soil conditions. And so just kind of really briefly with soil, you have soil particles or soil solids, and then you have the space in between the solids. And that space in between the solids is either filled with air or it's filled with water. And so really dry soil, lots of air, really wet soil, lots of water. And so it's this reciprocal relationship. And so what happens then is if you're full of water, then it actually leads to anaerobic conditions in the soil. The soil won't have oxygen in it anymore. Partly, this is due to all the organisms that are in the soil that need oxygen are going to use up that oxygen very quickly. And it's not getting replaced because A, you don't have any air spaces, and B, it's the diffusion of oxygen through water is 10,000 times slower than the diffusion of oxygen through air. And so as these microorganisms that are in the soil are using up the soil oxygen, it's not being replenished very quickly from above. And so what that does is those anaerobic soil conditions then set up a problem for plants because the roots need oxygen, the roots have to breathe, the roots have to take in oxygen to be able to break down sugars and make energy and that kind of thing. So for roots to grow, they need oxygen. And so that's going to be one of the big challenges in these flooded conditions. Okay?
So does that lead to,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, so does that lead to a bog kind of state?
Decomposition certainly slows down a lot. Yeah, you're shifting into those anaerobic pathways, and and that's also kind of what makes them a little bit more fertile is building up, you're accumulating carbon in these systems, right? Because that anaerobic pathways are so much slower in breaking things down. Yeah. And so these changes in the soil chemistry, like I said, the first thing that's happening is that oxygen is lost. Okay, and this is going to be the biggest threat to the plants. But then the microorganisms that are there some of them can switch and not use oxygen, but use other nutrient molecules, use other things to complete their respiration. So nitrogen is the next thing that's lost. And so microorganisms can use nitrogen, but then either nitrogen can be leached out of the system in the form of nitrate, moves out of the system going down, or it can be converted to nitrogen gas and it gets lost out of the system going up. So 2 different ways that nitrogen gets lost out of the system. After nitrogen is lost, then the microorganisms can switch over to using iron and manganese for what they need to do for their respiration pathways. And so what happens in these is that they actually become more available. So there's a chemical reaction that's happening that's taking them off of the soil surface and putting them into solution. And so that's how you get the gray color in the soil, is because the iron has come off of the soil surface and is in solution, has kind of washed away. Iron and manganese are things that plants use, but they don't need a whole lot of them. And so this is a case where less is more. Like if you have too much of a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. And so that's the case where iron and manganese can become a problem. The next two reactions that happen, and they happen in this order, continuing down this pathway, if we don't get the water off and it's continuing to be anaerobic, then sulfate gets reduced to hydrogen sulfide. Okay, and if you guys have ever smelled a rotten egg, okay, this is one of the reasons why wetlands get a bad rap, is because if they're this reduced, they're going to be producing hydrogen sulfide. And then finally, the system will actually take carbon dioxide and make methane. And so another reason why you get the methane would be your swamp gas. Okay, so it's another reason why wetlands get a bad rap. Okay, and so what the plants have to cope with is primarily this oxygen. And so a lot of the plant adaptations then, if we want to think about how do plants cope with these changes, a lot of the adaptations are going to deal with getting oxygen to the roots. Okay? Now some plants are going to be what we call regulators or avoiders. And what they're going to do is they're just not going to be active during the time of stress. And so they'll go dormant and kind of go through that stressful period just kind of asleep. Just like our trees are going dormant right now, we're getting ready to go through a really dry period. It's not that it's cold, that's not why plants shut down. Plants shut down because of lack of water. And so the water we get in the wintertime, the short day length, that kind of thing, the plants can't do their thing, so they go dormant. So the same thing in a wetland system is that you would have some plants that are regulators, they're avoiders, and they're just going to shut down. They're not going to do their thing during the stressful time. And then you've got ones that tolerate the stress. And they're going to have some kind of adaptation, whether it's morphological or physiological, so whether it's form or function, that allows them to still be doing what they do in the face of that stress. Okay? So there might be some kind of change in the form or the function. Okay? And like I said, the big thing is getting oxygen to the roots. So one of the things that can happen is that some plants, not all plants, but some plants that are flood tolerant develop what is known as aerenchyma, or loosely translated air tissue. And so in a normal plant, a non-flood tolerant plant, all of this area in here would be full of cells. But this water plant here, the cells have been kind of removed, and you've got these big air spaces. And so all of this here, I feel like this is suitable for framing. I think this is a really beautiful
It
picture.
is a cool picture.
It is a really cool picture.
Yeah.
But all of that airspace, what it does is it allows air to come in at the stem, and then they can move air down to the roots, because the stem is typically still above water. So getting the air into the stem and then pumping it down to the roots. And the plants can actually pump enough down that you can actually be sending oxygen out of the root back into the soil and start reversing some of those reactions that you had in the soil that made it such a challenging place to live. So another thing that some of these plants do is they have more shallow roots. So roots are going for the water. And in a flooded system, they don't have to go for the water, right? The water's right there. In a prairie, why do we have 6, 10, 15 feet deep roots?
Yeah.
Get down to the water, right? Well, in a wetland, you don't have to get down to the water's there. And so they're going to end up with much more shallow root system. And part of that has to do with also that oxygen demand. So if I spread my roots out shallow, I'm going to be closer to the surface of the soil. And there's usually typically an aerobic layer, a layer that gets oxygen through it. It just doesn't penetrate down very far. And so the plant can actually be, exchanging oxygen through that wet soil at the surface. Okay, so it can still get oxygen in. And then there's this other thing called pneumatophores. And pneumatophores are kind of air roots, if you want to translate it. And so these pneumatophores are these structures that stick up. And I think there's still a lot to know about pneumatophores. I don't think we've completely figured it out. But they have these, what they call lenticels, these spongy tissue on them. Instead of being woody and resistant to air going through them, they're spongier. And so air can come in. And again, those air is going to come in and it's going to go down. And it's going to go down to the roots, and so the roots can do their things that they need to do. Because if the roots are dying, the plant, even though it's standing in water, if the roots are dying, the plant thinks there's water stress and actually closes the stomata and stops doing photosynthesis. So it'll look like it'll wilt. It'll look like it's needs water when actually it doesn't need any water. So this is how we all kill our houseplants. All right, so these are looking at mangroves, and so that shallow root system isn't going to be a very stable thing. And if you've walked through a wetlands before, when it's flooded, it's really not a very stable system, right? You kind of sink in. And so in order, some plants will do prop roots. So these structures that are coming off of the trunk here are roots that are coming out to prop that plant up. Think about mangroves, they're on the coast, they're going to have tidal action that they have to withstand. And so those prop roots help them withstand that, they help withstand the fact that they have shallow roots. And then all of these little, like almost like soda straws out here, those are all the pneumatophores. Those are all things that are taking the oxygen down into the roots. Okay? Closer to home, we might see things like cypress swamps. Okay? And here too, you're looking at something that helps with the structure, helps stabilize them. So having the buttresses where the stem is fluted out at the bottom, that's going to help give it stability. And then the knees, the cypress knees, are kind of the same thing as those soda straws in the mangroves. Those are also pneumatophores. And so again, they have kind of a spongy tissue. If we could look at them closely, we'd see like little air holes, spongy tissue, and we believe that air goes down and they feed the roots. And again, get that air down to the roots are then able to continue to grow, and the plant is actually oxygenating the soil around it. So how cool is that? That is cool. I'm just saying. I teach a plant class at Baker, and I spend a lot of the semester going, plants are cool. And they really are. So we've got this challenge of anaerobic soil. Solution, we're going to have these adaptations to get oxygen down to the roots. Another challenge, flooded soils are less stable. And so we're going to have those shallow root systems, we're going to have things like prop roots, we're going to have buttressed, trunks, things like that. Okay, so very simple kind of situation. A place like Covera, a salt marsh, or a coastal system, a coastal wetlands, they're going to have the problem of salt water. So salt water adds another layer of challenges for the plants. And here there's two challenges. One is water uptake. Okay, so what happens there's this balance of, let me go back in the day, right? Way before all of our times, how did people preserve things?
Salt.
They salted it, right? And that salt would pull the moisture out. Okay, so the same thing's going to happen to a plant in salt water. Instead of actually being able to take up that water, the salt in the water is actually pulling water out of the plant. And I could demonstrate this for you. If I had a little plant here and I fed it with salt water, you could see it like wilt. And then, you could give it fresh water and you could wash the salts out and it would pop back up. So this is a challenge. So even though they're surrounded by water, it's like, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. This is what's happening to these plants, right? And so one way to do this challenge is to increase root growth. So put down more roots than shoots. Okay, so you're shunting more growth to the ground, into the soil to have more roots to bring more water in. The other thing you can do is reduce water loss. Okay, and so you're going to reduce water loss at the top of the plant, because all the water is going out the top, coming in the bottom, goes in through the roots, through the shoots, out the leaves, right? And so if I can have a more compact plant body, there's going to be less evaporation from wind and things like that. It's close to the ground. If there's evaporation, it's all kind of compact, there's high humidity around there, it's not going to lose as much water. I can also have thicker leaves. I can have more succulent leaves. And so one of the things I might do is actually pump water into my leaves, make my leaves thicker, and in doing so, then I'm changing the salt balance. And so I'm affecting that salt to water ratio that's in the leaves. Okay? And then all plants are covered with a wax layer. So just like we wax our cars to protect our cars, okay, plants wax their bodies to prevent water loss. Okay? And so in plants like these, if I want to reduce water loss, and we would see this in other plants. I mean, think about where else we see succulents and where else do we see really waxy, reduced leaves and things like that. We see them in desert plants, right? Mm-hmm. So these are similar adaptations for wetland plants that are in salt water that we see in desert plants. Okay? And so a couple pictures here, just a couple different salt marsh kind of plants. You can see in this case, very reduced leaves. You've got a succulent stem. Here, again, succulent leaves. So they're reduced in size and they're succulent, and that's going to help with this problem. The other problem is that you're going to have ions that are going to be toxic to the plant. So as salt dissolves in water, right, you get sodium and chloride, you have other ions that are in those salts. So salt is loosely, two mineral ions that are coming together. And so those are going to disassociate. And so they're not going to be necessarily good for the plant. Like I said, sometimes less is more. So one thing the plant can do is restrict entry. So there's ways that the plant can actually, there's barriers that there's a waxy layer in the root that can actually prevent these ions from making it into the conducting tissue. If they don't do that and the ions do get in, so if the ions get past that barrier, so you can kind of think about, like, this is kind of like our own immune system, right? We have barriers to entry. So our skin is a barrier to entry, and then once it gets past the skin, then other things happen. Same thing's going to happen in the plant. You've got a barrier to entry, but if I get past that barrier, then I might transport those ions to the older leaves and then shunt the older leaves. So drop the leaves off. Okay, so have some deciduousness to it. I could stick those ions kind of away in the corner kind of thing. So I can put them into a vacuole, which is just a membrane-bound sac that's in the middle of the cell. So I can pump things into there. And once it's on the other side of the membrane, it's kind of stuck. Or I can put them in the cell walls, and the cell walls aren't alive. And so it doesn't really matter what I stick out there. As long as the living tissue doesn't have all the salts in it, it's good. So I can kind of put things away, kind of sequester them. Or I can actually secrete it out. And so some of these plants that are really adapted to these conditions actually have salt glands or salt hairs or even salt bladders where they secrete the salt to the outside. And so this is an example of a mangrove. So this is a mangrove leaf. And these here with the arrows pointing to them are actually salt glands on the mangrove leaf. And so the mangrove, in that salt water all the time, it's excreting salt out out the top, if you will. And so again, we have these two challenges. Water uptake, so I'm going to increase my root to shoot ratio. I'm going to have other mechanisms to prevent water loss. And then the high concentration of toxic ions, I'm going to try and prevent their entry. If they get in, I'm going to sequester them, or I'm going to boot them out. And I'm short and sweet and to the point, so this is all I have to say. Other than please come visit the Baker Wetlands in Lawrence, Kansas.